I'm going to talk a little bit about decentralization. It's a very interesting topic emerging in blockchain and Cardano. And for example, in Fund 8, I noticed a lot of proposals using the word decentralized as kind of a vanilla kind of word, meaning it's good. And centralization is bad. And that strikes me as being very naive and missing the mark completely. And even potentially manipulative way of thinking about it. But what does it mean? And what should we think about it? So my friend Alex Sagaden forwarded me this article from Medium. It's really quite a good article. The meaning of decentralization. Deconstructing a little bit the notion, and this apparently is kind of a famous diagram. He's saying this, it's not about that. This author, Buterin, talking about decentralization. So in this relatively well-known model, there's centralized, decentralized, and distributed. And Buterin is saying, no, that's not really very useful. But rather, we can think of it in these three different kinds of decentralization. So I like this nuance, but I could not fit. I don't really see a difference between architectural decentralization and logical decentralization. Although clearly political decentralization is understandable as different from architectural. So the examples being, my example is always BitTorrent. Architecturally decentralized and politically decentralized. So that one makes sense. Blockchains, logically decentralized. I'm not sure. It seems like theoretically that's how it is, but in fact, that's really not how it is, as Charles Hoskinson was, discussing pretty recently, 6 weeks ago, that article by Moxie, the cryptologist, saying, no, it's still basically going through X number of servers. So I don't quite like this model because the test, the simple heuristic for logical is if you cut it in half, well, both halves still fully operate as independent units. And I think that's exactly the same test you can make for architectural decentralization. And furthermore, I'm not sure if really talking about decentralization is really very useful, because it seems to me it's more of a strategy than a value, right? To get something either centralized or decentralized, that's a strategy for some kind of outcome. Like if there's a lot of chaos and overlap of effort, you might want to centralize in order to make it more efficient. So centralization would be a strategy. Likewise, if something is too controlled and bogged down with bureaucracy, then decentralization would be a strategy to make it more efficient. So in both cases, the value of efficiency could be reasonably moved forward with either one of those strategies. I like the notion of distribution better because distribution is pointing at the actual physical layout. However, all this to say, I still don't think these are very useful principles for us to be talking about, or I guess concepts, models. And I'm thinking more and more that, especially for Cardano, and I can't speak for the other communities, but especially with Cardano, it seems to me that a better lens, rather than talking about centralization, decentralization, is to look at permaculture. Permaculture, the design science. What is permaculture? Permaculture is a creative design science, or a creative design process. Creative design process. It's a design process, right? And already that's somewhat different from talking about centralizing and decentralizing, right? Saying No, what if we think of blockchain more as a design process, right from the get-go, and starting applying design principles to it right away, and that there's a process, and that's this a whole systems thinking informed by ethics and design principles. How could that apply to blockchain, or how does it apply to blockchain? I think this is a good model. Let's look at it. Let's think about it. So first of all, to say, you will hear people say, "Oh, permaculture, it doesn't work. It's not scalable. You can't, feed the whole world, with people composting and making swales and on these hands-on approaches in permaculture is a hands-on kind of thing. You're integrating animals, you're integrating different plants, you're working with nature. And a criticism is, oh, that could never work. We have too many people, and yet that we certainly lived like that for thousands of years. Basically, people growing food and raising animals in plots of land. That's how it's always worked. There are some absolutely fascinating and inspiring videos out there about how permaculture works. For example, greening the desert with Jeff Lawton is my favorite one, where he takes a plot of land in Jordan and just it's absolutely crap land. And by using these principles, which I'll show you in 1 minute, gets a yield out of that place. After some years, they've got fig trees growing there. They've even got mushrooms growing there, which was previously a desert. They don't have to drill for water. And this stuff works. So that's the first thing. It works. So that's more that can be said for industrial farming, I think, because you wouldn't have peak soil and peak fertilizer and peak oil and all these things if industrial agriculture was working very well. So what are the options? Let's look at these principles. And I am arguing today that these principles could and should apply to blockchain, the development of blockchain. I'm kind of spitballing here. I'm doing this on the fly, but I think you'll get the idea. So here they are. Observe and interact. That means if you have some land and you want to raise some food, you don't decide what you're going to do and then go and do it. You decide that you're going to do something, and then you go to that land and you sit there on the ground and you look around and you see what's going on with the weather patterns, the wind, the water, where's the water table, what are the insects doing, what plants are already there, right? How much light is there, all that kind of stuff. First, observe. I forgot to say, look at the soil, which is arguably the most important thing. So I wonder, what is the equivalent of soil in blockchain? Catching and storing energy, for example, catching water. Water is energy when you're thinking of plants and animals. So our normal way of thinking about water is we want to take the water out of the city as fast as possible with our huge, expensive drainage systems. Get all that water out of the water quickly. We don't want any puddles in the city. Meanwhile, we're bringing water all back in and cleaning it with its chemical processes so that we can drink it, which is silly, right? So we could catch that. We could catch the water catchment. It's called water catchment. So instead of letting the water go through, there are ways of catching the water and keeping it in that system. Cleaning it, letting it be cleaned by gravel and plants, which is how it naturally is cleaned in rivers and streams. Obtaining a yield, you're not doing this as a charity. You need to have inputs. Each person raising that food has to get something out of it in order to keep going. Inputs and outputs. So we do have to get something in return for our efforts, but notice it's not called a profit, right? It's not called an income. It's a yield, so that we can sustain our own thing. Applying self-regulation and accepting feedback. So self-regulation, this speaks to the responsibility piece. And that it's a fundamentally ethical model that we're talking about. And this is kind of an interesting point, right? Where people in blockchain, Cardano, are talking about decentralization separately from ethics. And isn't it true that almost any system, even battled capitalism, even battled communism, almost any system could work if you had only very sincere, positively oriented people. But we're going to have bad actors. And so you can't really, it's a bit silly to factor out the bad actors and only talk about decentralization when there are bad actors in the system. And we know that already in Cardano. There are bad actors. We're seeing it in the proposals. People gaming the system. I'm sure those people have their reasons. To me, it seems like taking the boards off the lifeboat and selling them, or selling the sails off the lifeboat, but that's another video. But to say that we can't really talk about systems without talking about ethics, it seems to me, and that's if that's a principle, then does everybody agree with that principle? And this is already somewhat different from the emergent principle. Like when you compare with what people are talking about with blockchain, emergence is one of the main things you hear. Oh, it's important. Emergence is important. We don't want to have this top-down control. And here I'm talking about governance in the blockchain environment, the DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization, the DAO. How does a group of people govern themselves when there isn't an overarching hierarchy? Similarly, inclusivity, even radical inclusivity. Whereas permaculture is saying, well, no, we're not radically inclusive. The main gate is, are people going to be self-regulating and accepting feedback? Are people going to be responsible? If people are not going to be responsible, then really they shouldn't be included, should they? Because it's not ultimately a political thing, right? Growing food is not ultimately a political thing. Like you want to get food. You want to support yourself in the community. It's not primarily a political statement, although of course it's a huge political statement at the same time. Using and valuing renewable resources, like in blockchain, that's obviously the people. And I think Cardano is actually doing kind of a good job of this with the Catalyst proposals, that whole program, because they are looking at thousands of people out in the world with ideas about how to bring practical use cases to the ecosystem. Producing no waste, well, that's a tough one, right? That's where things are being duplicated. And this is it not a much better way to think of centralization, decentralization, if those are actually strategies? And the principle is that you want as little waste as possible. And if that were the strategy or the lens, how would that change the conversation around centralization bad, decentralization good? Like, according to what values system, or according to according to, the principles have to underlie the whole thing. So what is the principle of decentralization? What's the principle underlying that? It's not a thing in itself. It's only a strategy. Okay, designing from patterns to details. This also speaks to the architecture. Integrating rather than segregating, that also speaks to architecture. And when I say architecture, I mean as in distribution, decentralization. Using small and slow solutions, that's apparently a more feminine way of going into business, rather than making the grand gesture and going to the VC capitalist. That this one does have to do with investment. I'll leave that one at that. Using and value diversity. Isn't that a better way to frame the underlying value of radical inclusivity. But again, inclusivity is more of a strategy to me than a principle. Using and valuing diversity is more of a principle. Principle being that the more you can do it, or if we can do this, you'll be on solid ground. Like how to apply the principle. Not to make a political statement, though. Using and valuing diversity because it's useful, because it's when you look at nature, nature's full of diversity, right? And we have this industrial mindset of, oh, let's have only almonds in that field. Let's get rid of all the other species of plants, and let's bring in the bees by trucks, because the bees can't live in a monoculture field, but we need bees, so we'll just cart the bees in from 500 miles away and feed the bees the corn syrup. And it's no wonder the bees are having a hard time, and we'll be right behind them. So diversity is more resilient, right? That's how we could be thinking of diversity rather than as a political thing, as a virtue signaling exercise. No, it's actually more about resilience, right? Using edges and valuing the marginal. Also, it's still valuing inclusivity, but in a more specific and useful way, right? That at the edges of these ecosystems is where you get a huge amount of interaction between, for example, different animal types or different plant types, different things happening at the edge. It's a very fertile place, like the edges of a pond. Lots of the action happening at the edges of the pond. Creatively using and responding to change. And that too speaks to centralization and decentralization, doesn't it? That the architecture, I assume, of the whole network is changing constantly. I'm not a programmer. I won't say more about the architecture, but it seems that, again, this is a better way to think of it than this very simplistic and dualistic way of saying decentralization good, decentralization bad. Okay, that's what I want to say for now. I'd like to come back to this topic because it seems important to me, and that these principles seem like a really good way to have a different kind of conceptual framework as blockchain evolves, as Cardano evolves, as a community, that we think of it as a big design project, and that needs to have very organic design principles that are leading to yield, leading to something that people can use, truly useful rewards. You can't work on an empty stomach. Okay, so that's all I want to say about this for now. Michael Modig here. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.